Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Larry Pratt about gun terminology and gun politics in the United States. Mr. Pratt is the Executive Director Emeritus of Gun Owners of America. He is a frequent guest on radio and television programs and previously served in the Virginia legislature. He is the author of Armed People Victorious and On the Firing Line, Essays in the Defense of Liberty. He is also the editor of Safeguarding Liberty, the Constitution and Citizens Militias. You can follow his work at gunowners.org. You can find him on Facebook under Gun Owners of America and on Twitter at Gun Owners. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/gun-politics. Larry, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, sure. Thank you so much for joining me. So I want to start, and this is a common place to start on the show, but that's by defining terminology. It seems like no matter what the subject is, people throw around terms and they don't always know exactly what they mean. And this particularly seems to be a problem when talking about issues related to guns and types of guns and gun legislation, all the related issues that we'll get into today. So can you just go over some key terms that you think will be important for listeners to know as we go through this conversation?
Perhaps the term that has been subject to most confusion is that of the so-called assault weapon. We talk about an assault weapons ban. We talk about assault weapons on the street. Well, in a technical sense, assault weapons, unless they fall off a military convoy truck, are not going to be on the street. Assault weapons describes a military firearm. An assault weapon has a selector switch on it near the trigger so that the shooter can select semi-automatic fire, which means one pull of the trigger gives you one shot fired, and nothing else happens until you pull the trigger again. And then on some, there's just one other position, and that's full auto, and the gun keeps firing until you remove your finger from the trigger and the bullets are completely exhausted from the magazine. And then there are typically those with a third position on that selector switch, which means you can fire a 3-round burst. And that's the actual assault weapon. That's also a machine gun, which would be another accurate definition. There are different kinds of machine guns. This is a light machine gun. There are ones that are sometimes depicted in combat movies where you see it on a tripod or a bipod, and it's barely all that one man can carry. They're quite good size. They also are machine guns. The semi-automatic firearm that often gets called an assault weapon is simply a gun that's been around for give or take 100 years. It's been used in hunting and recreation, self-defense, and certainly is an excellent firearm for militia purposes, militia being primarily designed as a buffer to guard against government tyranny. But the semi-automatic firearm you pull the trigger once, you get one round fired, one bullet fired, and that's it until you pull the trigger again. It might have a magazine with 3 rounds, 5 rounds, 10 rounds. It can be almost any number. Maybe 10 or 15 would be a common large capacity magazine, and that's it. And then the semi-automatic might have a built-in fixed magazine to hold 3 to 5 rounds. There are shotguns with the same feature, and a lot of shotguns are single or double shot, and you put the round in the chamber each time you fire it. You have to open it and take out the old one and put in a new one. And then there's the single shot. and typically that might be a .22 target rifle, and that might be the thing that a little boy or girl goes out and shoots as part of their initial experience in the shooting sports.
Okay, and what do current gun laws at the federal level, state levels, local levels say about the legality of owning these types of guns and selling these types of guns?
We've got 50 different states and 51 different firearms jurisdictions, probably more if we count the territories in addition to the District of Columbia. They're all somewhat different. There's a national law which governs the kinds of firearms that are typically available and what ages they might be available to. But at the end of the day, you're going to be able to buy a handgun at the age of 18 or 21, depending on the state you live in, and it could well be the same for rifles and shotguns. Typically, shotguns are a little bit less restricted than are others, firearms, and that's the variety that we have in this tapestry of our federal republic.
So when gun control advocates and others make claims that, well, most people don't need to own certain types of weapons, what types of weapons are they talking about, and are there any merits to those claims, or where do those claims fall apart?
You know, when you hear somebody say that you don't need something, that at least raises my hackles. Who are these elitists to tell me, do I need a second stove in my home? I don't need that. I don't need a 300 horsepower car or a 150 horsepower engine. What is it about these people that knows better than I do what I need? And since we're talking about need, perhaps they'd like to go and interview the Korean merchants who several years ago defended themselves and their properties in Los Angeles during the riots at that time, and they had semi-automatic fire rifles with most of them with fairly good-sized magazines. Those were the stores owned by those men and women that were not attacked, that were not burned. They were the ones that were able to keep islands of peace in a sea of chaos and destruction. Tell those Korean merchants they don't need a semi-automatic firearm with a large magazine. And tell other people similarly situated that they don't need those firearms. We've had post-hurricane situations where the police were unable to keep order. Same thing. People immediately began forming ad hoc militias to protect their property, their neighborhoods, and they use these kinds of firearms typically. So that I think is a very bad term to use, that we don't need something. And the Second Amendment doesn't speak about need. Second Amendment says for a well-regulated state of a militia being necessary for the security of a free state. Well, a free state from whom? Well, free from the national government, free from the feds, to protect freedom at the more local level. Now, if we want to talk, I guess that's a need. We need freedom, and we need our semi-automatics, at least, for the protection of our freedom. So those elitists that think they know what our needs are kind of reveal their ignorance when they talk like that.
No, they do. So why are these claims, why is this idea that's put forward about banning certain types of weapons, why is it so appealing when the average person, or maybe someone who's not the average person, but when anybody is sitting there watching television or reading the newspaper and these ideas are put forth? Well,
I have after many years of dealing with anti-Second Amendment, anti-self-defense advocates, I've become rather convinced that there's a couple of related points of view that they share. One is that they are viscerally opposed to self-defense. They genuinely think that an individual having a gun for self-defense is going to make a situation inherently more dangerous. Violence begets violence. And they share that view not only at the personal level with somebody on the street with his firearm carried on his person, but they also have that same view about their own country being armed and protecting itself. And that's why I think we can explain Hillary Clinton and others with her in the State Department withdrawing the self-defense forces from the Benghazi outpost in Libya, because they thought that show of military strength was simply going to provoke more violence. Violence could be avoided by disarming, by bending the knee, bending over the neck. I think is where they genuinely are coming from. And the fact that it time after time doesn't work out the way they hope it will doesn't seem to have changed their way of thinking, because for them, apparently, intentions are what determine the success of a policy, not its results. Now, the other reason that I think the liberal mindset is opposed to individual gun ownership and carrying of guns by private citizens is they are inherently statist in their mentality. They want to control everything. And it's doggone hard to control everything when the peasants are running around with their own fire sticks.
Well, and of course, a lot of these people in turn have armed bodyguards and own firearms themselves, so there's tremendous hypocrisy there.
Oh, it's fabulous that Hillary Clinton, one of the major advocates of civilian disarmament, is protected by some of the most highly trained individuals in the world, using some of the most sophisticated firearms that you can imagine, with accessories and whatnot. That's okay, because she's different. She's special. She deserves it. But you and I, well, we're not professionals. We're not trained. We can't be trusted. And so, therefore, we should be disarmed.
Right. So I want to look at a few other criticisms that gun control advocates might have of the current setup. And typically one that comes up is background checks. So what does the current background check process and the laws surrounding it look like? And what are the criticisms that come up related to background checks, and do they have any merits?
Well, the hope for the background check is that it's going to keep guns out of the wrong hands. The fact of the matter is that in one of the recent years of record, there were some 20-plus million background checks. There were in the neighborhood of 40 prosecutions that resulted from it. In other words, we can conclude that it has almost zero utility as a crime-fighting tool. It's an enormous diversion of police resources. And rather than depend on the government pursuing some chimerical program that demonstrably doesn't produce any results, and year after year has produced the same near zero results, it would be much better to focus on encouraging individuals to defend themselves, because after the background check has been done and not kept guns out of bad guys' hands, we still have citizens being assaulted by punks. And when the assault begins, there's about 5 minutes, if a call can be made right away, before the cops can get there. It'll be 5 to 6 minutes minimum whenever the call is finally able to be made to 911. And what do you do, as Sheriff Clark of Milwaukee County has asked, while you're waiting for his men to get there? And so he urges people to be armed, says, we're in this together. Can't we be partners?
Right. And moving on to another criticism that you often hear from these people, they'll say that guns just aren't safe to have around the house, that children will likely access them and they're dangerous to children, or that having a gun in the home might increase the potential of suicide taking place. Is there any reason to be worried about gun safety issues, and you in turn use that as a justification for gun legislation?
Well, we're really talking here about emotion rather than facts. And I've alluded to it already, but I have discussed these issues with liberals, and at the end of the day, when I've shown them what the data are telling us, they say, well, all the same, I just don't feel safe with guns around, even though you've just finished arguing that they're better off in a jurisdiction that is well armed, where people can carry a concealed firearm. A dozen states now where they can carry concealed firearms with no permit, no permission whatsoever from the government. Some of our safer states, actually. And so the idea that we're going to be safer by getting guns out of the home would really make more sense if we were also willing to get rid of our bathtubs and our stairs, because those are even more dangerous.
Right, yeah. Plenty of people, unfortunately, suffer injuries, serious injuries, from bathtub and stair-related incidents.
And death.
So, and of course, there are all sorts of ordinary household items around any dwelling that could cause injuries if used improperly.
So that's life. Life is inherently dangerous. Bad things can happen. But there's something about the firearm that's both visceral and then, as I've argued, ideological, that impels some people to want to really make a strong push to get rid of the legal ownership of these instruments, of these objects. They don't have the same concern about automobiles that kill some 3 times more people, or doctors whose wrong prescriptions have an equally lethal result. But we're willing to accept those consequences because we understand that the benefits of the doctor far outweigh any of his goof-ups, and the benefits of the automobile similarly far outweigh the reckless use of the automobile. So by the same token, firearms are used some 4 to 5 times minimum more by individuals in self-defense than they are in criminal enterprise. And so we should take away one of the most effective means of keeping us safe, even though it has some attendant downside risks. But then so do automobiles, and we just don't hear that clamor about, well, we've got to take automobiles off the street.
Right. So, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to look at this a little deeper. Something that you'll hear from people on the left or people arguing in favor of gun control is that, well, look at England or look at fill-in-the-blank country.
Sure.
And look at what gun ownership looks like there and what gun laws look like there, and it's so much better. What's the truth about these comparisons across countries?
Sure. There's something about the British that is simply different. And it was some of the differences that impelled many of the American colonists to leave Britain because they didn't like them. But the fact of the matter is that before gun control in the early part of the last century hit England, they had a lower murder rate than most other places, about the same as today. Actually, it went up slightly after their gun control law was imposed, but I don't think there was any necessary relationship. It wasn't much of an increase. It's just probably a typical fluctuation, more likely. That being said, that the British are less likely to kill each other, they are extremely violent people. And England has the 4th highest violent crime rate in the world. That's saying something, because the league leaders are Venezuela, El Salvador, Jamaica, Honduras. And so for England to be right up there with champs like that is stunning. And they have derived, I would say, zero benefit. Au contraire, it's worse in merry old England. Their murder rate stayed the same before and after gun control, but what really changed was, man, you can get raped, you can get mugged, you can get assaulted, much more likely in England than many other places.
Right, and of course one comparison that doesn't come up very often but really should is the comparison between the United States and Mexico, where gun ownership is much more prevalent in the United States. There are many more gun laws and restrictions on the books in Mexico, and yet the United States is much safer, and you can look at places right along the border where there are cultural similarities, very strong cultural similarities between the cities in Texas or wherever you're talking about as versus the Mexican cities on the other side, and yet the cities in the U.S. are much, much safer places in every instance.
Stunning differences in murder rates along the Mexican border. Yeah. So that you've pointed to a place in their argument that just doesn't fly, and they really be better off not directing our attention to Mexico.
Right, and that's not to say that gun ownership is the only factor in this. Of course, there are other factors too, but it's one that they seem to ignore that it seems to me would be rather significant when you're having this conversation.
And the cultural similarities, I've been to Nuevo Laredo, I've been to Laredo, Texas, and it's a good thing if you can speak Spanish on either side of that border. That is a Mexican culture from start to finish, and yet in the U.S. side, the murder rate is quite low, lower than many gun control places in the United States, for instance, like Chicago. And yet right across the border, people who may even commute from Mexico to work in the United States, but living in Mexico, they live in a much more dangerous place.
Right, and El Paso has been named several times as the safest major U.S. city or medium to large size.
And right across the river in Ciudad Juarez, it is absolutely a stunningly bloody place.
Right. So what are some of the other criticisms that you hear from gun control advocates, and why is the so-called gun lobby so vilified in some of these circles?
Well, I think the vilification might stem from the fact that guns are viewed as nothing more than killing instruments, and if you're for people having guns, then you're for the violent crime that exists in the country, and you don't have any compassion. And we're the ones with compassion who want to disarm people. We want to make things better. Now, they don't look at the fact that in Chicago, it's very much the contrary. In New York, in Baltimore, where their laws have been applied, it's not. But they still are convinced they're the compassionate ones, and therefore their opponents are heartless. It turns out the opposite is actually the case. But we're talking about emotion, about how I feel versus how I think. And the opponent of gun control typically is someone who does try to think sequentially with a sequential logic, with facts, and to try to keep emotion under control as much as possible. The person who's advocating gun control is emotional, is thinking with their emotions and their feelings, and it's just like we're talking past each other.
Right. Now, I want to move on to the arguments from gun rights advocates, and we've obviously touched on some of these by refuting the gun control arguments, and we'll focus on the self-defense issue in a moment, but and statistics related to that. But what are some of the most common arguments made by gun rights advocates?
Well, I think the most important one, it may not be the most common because you did put that in your question, but perhaps the most important argument is that it is in the Constitution and it's there not because of self-defense, not because of recreation, not because of hunting, even hunting for subsistence. It's there to protect us from the government. That's a kind of a politically incorrect thing to say, but you just can't escape that conclusion when you read what the founders were saying at the time, what they'd been dealing with. After all, when they put their Constitution together, our Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, which contains the Second Amendment, they had just finished whooping the most powerful army of the most powerful empire in the world. They didn't do it through diplomacy. Diplomacy was involved to a certain extent. We got the French to help us at certain key points. But the fact of the matter is, we would have been run over and ground up and spat out had we not been able to, let me put it crudely, shoot British soldiers. Had we not been able to defend ourselves from their attacks, no amount of diplomacy would have had any effect whatsoever. And so, before anything else is offered in defense of owning guns, it is for national defense, for the security of a free state. And then there are the other benefits of, yes, you're much safer in Northern Virginia than you are in Washington, D.C., where they have been told at the expense of a twisted, broken arm by federal courts that you will allow gun ownership, yet they've done everything they can to discourage it. And I doubt even after another court order following the first Heller decision back in, 8 years ago maybe, that there are, I hope there's more than 100 concealed carry permittees in Washington, but I don't think so. In Northern Virginia, getting a concealed carry, anywhere in Virginia, getting a concealed carry permit is no big deal, quite simple, pay a little money, a written exam. They do want to see that you have a pulse, so there is a physical presentation involved. But basically, it's a nothing burger. They just want to make sure they're not facilitating Jesse James, I guess, which is still kind of stupid because Jesse James isn't going to go through the process. But in any case, guns are rather readily available to be carried concealed, let alone you can buy them on a street corner, literally, in Northern Virginia or anywhere in the state. Well, what's the difference? In Northern Virginia, the murder rate on any given year is at or below the rate of murder in England, which I've already conceded is quite admirably low. It's like 1 per 100,000, 1 point something, whatever, on any given year, right there competing with England. But the other thing that England doesn't have, or the Washington, D.C. doesn't have, they don't have a low murder rate, although it's much lower than it was under the days of the gun ban, but they have a higher murder rate, they have a higher violent crime rate. It's above the national average, probably twice what the national average is, and it's well below here in Northern Virginia, where we have a very urban environment. I mean, we're as much or more a city than Washington, D.C., right across the river. So the demographics don't make a good argument for the gun controllers. We've got the racial diversity, the income diversity, the congestion, the density of population, you name it. But one of the really significant differences is you go to commit a crime against a citizen in Northern Virginia, and you may get yourself shot. You do it in Washington, D.C., very unlikely. And so it's just got to eat their heart out that well-armed, gunned up, you own a machine gun in Northern Virginia, and people do. And yet the murder rate is maybe this year it's slightly lower than it is in England.
Sure. So let's turn our attention back to the self-defense argument. What are some statistics that would help illustrate just how important the self-defense argument is, and how do statistics related to self-defense compare to statistics related to injuries and deaths and other horrible tragedies?
Well, typically where self-defense is successful, you also find a fairly low accident rate from guns. People that own guns tend to be more careful and knowledgeable. One of the things that is very interesting, there's a book written by a couple of shrinks from the criminal hospital for the criminally insane, St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C., and after years of examination, they concluded that the difference between their patients and the folks that were their neighbors is that their neighbors assumed that the laws should be kept. The folks that they were dealing with as their patients made no such assumption. They just did whatever they wanted that they felt they could get away with. And if it meant killing you, too bad. That's the criminal mind. A very fundamental difference between the way the criminal thinks and looks at the world and looks at other people than the way the rest of us do. And so I think we have to keep that in mind. This is something that no amount of pretty please is going to change. The only thing that's likely to control a criminal, they found in their study, Dr. Samano and his associate, was that if a criminal thought that his attempt to commit a crime was likely to lead to injury or death, well, then he delayed, deferred, went some other place to commit his crime. So, I mean, they're rational. They just don't start from the same point that the rest of us do.
Sure. So before we wrap up, I want to look at a few issues and events that have been in the news recently that have helped shape the gun debate and have helped shape gun politics. So first I want to look at the issue of teachers having guns in classrooms and guns being carried on college campuses. These have been controversial issues of late in particular, and where I live in Texas, the guns on college campus issue has especially come up as related to the University of Texas. So what do you make of the controversy surrounding those issues?
I think it's kind of interesting that even in Texas, which arguably has, to one extent or another, a quote-unquote gun culture, people are much more at ease with guns, with other people having guns, carrying guns. But when it comes to schools, to one degree or another, across the country, that's different. Really? It's different. So we should have disarmament in a school, and it's perfectly acceptable to, by so doing, virtually put up a sign on the school wall that says, this is a murderer-friendly zone. Dirtbags welcome. Come in and pile up the bodies. We don't mind that. Where anywhere else in a mall, a church, a business of any sort, a home, we've gotten used to the idea that, guns really are probably a pretty handy thing, pretty good idea. But we have this mental block, maybe because it involves children, I don't know, that somehow we should avoid having guns around kids when that's precisely where we need them as much as anywhere else, because if we leave children, students, or anybody in a zone that's undefended, we are inviting the criminal element. Those are murder magnets. And the legislators that stay stuck on gun-free zones we have to, I think, deal with them quite roughly. And we have to point out to them the blood of the victims of the past and the present is on your hands. You are facilitating murder, even mass murder. Get off it. And I think that's the message that we have to. All but 3 of the public mass murders in this country have taken place since 1950 in gun-free zones. You'd think maybe that would be enough evidence to convince these legislators.
Well, you would think, and it's an amazing and staggering statistic. And of course, one gun-free zone where there was a mass shooting was in Newtown, Connecticut. a handful of years ago, where there was a mass shooting in an elementary school there. And, of course, that really changed the gun debate and the way gun politics was viewed throughout the U.S., and there are still repercussions from that. So how did the Newtown event change the gun discussion, and also some more recent events in Orlando in particular, but also in France and in Chicago and elsewhere?
Well, I think it's getting harder and harder for the anti-self-defense people to make their argument that we're better off having gun-free zones, because this is where the trouble occurs. They are the ones who have been the facilitators, inviting murderers to come into these zones. And, the problem with France is the whole country's a gun-free zone. The guns that the dirtbags used in shooting up that school and the shopping area were all illegal. It's illegal to have a gun, carry a gun. The gun laws of France they make the word draconian sound liberal. They are for real serious. They don't want you having a gun. The cops didn't have guns when the shooting started at that Bacalan Theater. They had to go and get guns out of locked facilities at their police stations. How many lives were lost while that was taking place? But who knows whether they're going to get that message or not. But hopefully we can learn that being defenseless is not a good defense.
Right. So where do you see gun politics headed? What do you think is in store in the immediate future, without getting too much into the election, although you can a little bit if you'd like, but just in general, where do you see that going? Well, and what do you view as solutions to the legitimate concerns that people have that just often have the wrong prescription to maybe the correct diagnosis, we could say?
Well, I'm encouraged because I've been at this for a long time, decades, and over that time I have seen the arguments for gun control shift from being, well, of course, how could you be against my position? Are you some kind of caveman? You crawl out from under a rock? Well, now the person making that kind of argument is no longer heard, and they're frequently reduced to what I've mentioned already. Well, I just don't feel safe with knowing that somebody in the same room has a gun. That is not a very convincing argument in view of the array of data we can present to show that being disarmed is actually a deadly prescription. You may feel safe right until the bullet hits you in the face, but you're not safe. And the difference between feeling safe and being safe is what this argument really has been all about. And I think that's beginning to prevail. More Americans now than not think having a gun in the home is a good idea. They may not have one themselves, but they think it's a good idea to live in a neighborhood where people might have guns. We've seen a gradual change. Sea change might sound like it's been something that happened quickly. It hasn't been quick, but it's been steady, and it's been profound. And I think overall, the pro-self-defense position is winning ground almost every day. And the anti-self-defense people, I think, are really on hard times because their arguments have been tried and found wanting over decades, and they've run out of excuses that are at all convincing. They may convince each other, the media may still think it's cool, but most normal people do not think it's cool to be forced to be a victim.
Well, it's encouraging to hear you say that things seem to be headed in the right direction. Can you talk a little bit about Gun Owners of America and where they fit into this, as well as, and I don't know how comfortable you feel talking about this, but the NRA comes up a lot whenever the issue of gun politics is brought up. So can you also discuss the NRA and how they differ from Gun Owners of America?
Well, at one point, GOA, Gun Owners of America, and the NRA are involved in political activity. NRA is a lot more. They're involved in some excellent shooting programs for their members, training, marksmanship, and whatnot. We don't get into that at Gun Owners of America, but politics we do. So that's where the comparison can be made. And I think it helps to understand the difference between the two groups and the operating philosophy until this day by understanding how we came into existence. Sometime shortly after the Civil War, the NRA was formed by Union officers who were just appalled at the lack of marksmanship of so many of the Northern recruits. And the NRA was formed as an adjunct, as a handmaiden for the federal government, to have a mechanism for having young men get the kind of training they would need in case they're ever in the future, as they were, of course, called up for military duty, that they would at least at that time maybe know which end of a gun was which was almost a problem at the time of the Civil War. Gun Owners of America was formed some 100 years later, and it had nothing to do with marksmanship and gun handling, and only and everything to do with politics. And we were concerned that maybe the NRA didn't properly comprehend the lack of the total commitment, the animosity of the other side, the desire to get rid of gun ownership among the civilian population, and that no amount of compromise was going to satisfy that mentality. That I think was something that people who were good people involved in marksmanship and sporting activity, and they can understand why why people would be coming after them as some kind of a monster. Well, that never really happened until the NRA was forced by the liberals to get involved in politics in defending the Second Amendment in the 1960s. And by the middle of the 70s, it was obvious to our founder, who was a California state senator and quite an accomplished politician, that the NRA just didn't really see how much the enemy hated us. And so he formed Gun Owners of America as a no-compromise group that was going to insist on a restoration of the Second Amendment so that shall not be infringed was taken seriously.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I obviously mentioned some of this at the beginning of the show, but what are the best ways for listeners to follow your work? And if someone wants to learn more about the topics we've been discussing today, what should they take a look at?
We've got a treasure trove of information at gunowners.org. And if you go to gunowners.org, you can find, right as you get there, an easy way to sign up for free email alerts, which are is the mechanism we use to communicate to our members and others, those who chose not to pay anything, just to get those email so they can find out what's going on Capitol Hill. When they get an email from Gun Owners of America, it'll have embedded an email that they can send off to their members of Congress, making it very easy for them to be armchair lobbyists, and it's had a tremendous impact. Even when at times the NRA might have been heading in a different direction from where we were going, we were able to bring the Congress around because so many people were sending in those emails that the politicians decide, I don't want to head into that buzzsaw. What do you guys want? What does it take to make you happy? And then we let them know what it takes to make us happy.
Well, that's great. And I want to encourage everybody to go check out the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/gun-politics. And, of course, there will be links there to gunowners.org and the appropriate Facebook and Twitter pages and all the resources that have been mentioned over the course of this episode. So that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/gun-politics. And on the subject of email alerts, I want to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list, which can be found right on the website, because that's a great way to stay up to date on what's going on with the show, and also to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so you can make sure to never miss an episode. And Larry, thank you so much for joining me today and to refute some claims and clarify some terminology and take a look at the critical issue of guns and gun politics and gun rights and examine where it's going and where it has been and all and some of the factors that play in. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again in the future.
I would look forward to it. It's been a real pleasure being with you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.